So we may well call these people barbarians in respect to the rules of reason, but not in respect to ourselves who surpass them in every kind of barbarity. Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Michel de Montaigne's essay of Cannibals, which I'm reading out of the Norton Anthology of World Literature. So Montaigne was a Renaissance philosopher. He was a French Renaissance philosopher born in the 1530s, and he grew up during this sort of period of turmoil and uncertainty, the Protestant Reformation and the Catholic Counter-Reformation, periods of instability in terms of the French court, etc., and also periods with a vastly expanded concept of the world, right? The discovery of the American continents, an entire other hemisphere that people didn't know about. And Montaigne was fascinated by everything, in a sense. He was a true Renaissance man or Renaissance person, in the sense that we typically mean that, where he was a politician, he was a philosopher, he was interested in theology, he was interested in ideas of all different kinds. He was introspective. He considered his own society with a critical lens. He was this really, really smart, innovative guy. And Of Cannibals is actually an excellent example, in my opinion, of the Renaissance-ness of Montaigne. Like it reflects these sort of swirling and changing perspectives on thought and philosophy and values and things like this. On the one hand, in many, many ways, in this essay, Montaigne is well ahead of his time. In other ways, he's a little bit problematic. And so we get that sort of, he's super advanced for the Renaissance. From today's perspective, there are ways he's problematic, is maybe a more clear way of saying that. So basically, the essay Of Cannibals is about reports that Montaigne had and direct contact with people who had been to what's now Brazil and had encountered indigenous groups in Brazil. And early modern people were fascinated by indigenous Americans, North Americans, South Americans, Caribbean islanders, etc., etc. They just loved, they fucking went nuts for them. And often that occurred in very problematic ways. Things like capturing indigenous people and taking them back to France, in Montaigne's case, or Spain, or England, or the Netherlands, or wherever it was, and basically putting them on display. And Montaigne, according to this essay, did actually talk to an indigenous Brazilian, but he says because of the incompetence of his translator, he wasn't really able to get his questions across the way he wanted, but that's not the point. So most of Montaigne's information comes from this just regular guy. Montaigne's like, he's not that smart, so he's not making stuff up. Like he's dumb enough that I trust him to be telling the truth without an ulterior motive. And so Montaigne has this particular conception of what indigenous life in the Americas was like, of how people behaved. And this is where, from the perspective of 2024, things are not amazingly kosher. So I'll read you this passage. This is pretty typical of the kinds of things that Montaigne says about indigenous Americans. He says, "These nations then seem to me barbarous in this sense, that they have been fashioned very little by the human mind and are still very close to their original naturalness. The laws of nature still rule them, very little corrupted by ours, and they are in such a state of purity that I am sometimes vexed that they were unknown earlier, in the days when there were men able to judge them better than we. I am sorry that Lycurgus and Plato did not know of them, for it seems to me that what we actually see in these nations surpasses not only all the pictures in which poets have idealized the golden age and all their inventions in imagining a happy state of man, but also the conceptions and the very desire of philosophy. They could not imagine a naturalness so pure and simple as we see by experience, nor could they believe that our society could be maintained with so little artifice and human solder. This is a nation, I should say to Plato, in which there is no sort of traffic, no knowledge of letters, no science of numbers, no name for a magistrate or for political superiority, no custom of servitude, no riches or poverty, no contracts, no successions, no partitions, no occupations but leisure ones, no care for any but common kinship, no clothes, no agriculture, no metal, no use of wine or wheat. The very words that signify lying, treachery, dissimulation, avarice, envy, belittling, pardon, unheard of. So what's the problem with this? Well, this is what we now call the noble savage trope. It's a particular form of idealizing often indigenous people, but this may include indigenous North Americans, indigenous South Americans. This may include indigenous groups or native groups in places like Africa, South Asia, any place that from a colonialist's perspective is uncivilized. And Montaigne does something really, really interesting here, because he doesn't say these are uncivilized savages and we need to come in and give our clearly superior rules, laws, practices, etc. to them. He's actually 100% against that. But he does buy into this noble savage trope, which really limits the conceptualization of indigenous peoples, particularly to the extent that it sees them as closer to nature. And in some ways, that's not terrible. If you're talking about questions of, say, ecological stewardship or environmental sustainability, that's a good thing, actually. But when you're in a colonialist system that has a vested interest in seeing indigenous or uncivilized peoples as less human, and therefore less entitled to rights, protections, freedom, etc., then these people are closer to nature trope gets turned into, because they are more like animals, they are subject to domestication, which basically tends to mean cultural assimilation. Now, again, Montaigne himself is actually really opposed to this. He puts forward an idea in this essay of cultural relativism, centuries before the term cultural relativism would even be coined. So fairly early in the essay, he says this specifically. Now, to return to my subject, I think there is nothing barbarous and savage in that nation, that is, indigenous Brazilians, from what I have been told, except that each man calls barbarism whatever is not his own practice. For indeed, it seems we have no other test of truth and reason than the example and pattern of the opinions and customs of the country we live in. In other words, the only thing that makes indigenous Americans barbarous from a European perspective is that Europeans start from the assumption that their cultural values are the right ones. The way that they behave is the only correct way of behaving. And Montaigne is very skeptical of that. Again, remember the time period that Montaigne was living in. This was an era with the Protestant Reformation and the Counter-Reformation and the great religious wars in Europe. Montaigne saw in his own country, in France, the slaughter back and forth of Catholics and Protestants, each side attacking the other, the Catholic monarchy brutally repressing Protestants, etc., etc. Protestant, what we would today call religious fanatics or terrorists, attacking military, political, religious targets of the Catholic authorities, etc., etc. Montaigne was familiar with all of this. He was familiar with the rack. He was familiar with burning at the stake. And so, while he acknowledges that there is a lot of violence in indigenous Brazilian society, he ultimately stacks this up against the sort of systemic violence and the broad-scale, religiously motivated violence of his own society. And he says, on the whole, indigenous Americans are more civilized. They are better than we are. So that's a very interesting argument, ultimately. And the real sort of interesting turn at the end of this essay, he talks about how 3 indigenous Brazilians have been brought over to France. And one of the things he says is, 3 of these men, ignorant of the price they will pay someday in loss of repose and happiness for gaining knowledge of the corruptions of this side of the ocean, ignorant also of the fact that of this intercourse will come their ruin, which I suppose is already well advanced, poor wretches, to let themselves be tricked by the desire for new things, and to have left the serenity of their own sky to come and see ours. He anticipates post-colonialism, basically at the very outset of colonialism. He basically says, the fact that we Europeans are going to places like the Americas and imposing our culture, our values, our way of looking at the world will destroy the cultures that we are encountering. And even the fact that these 3 men wanted to come to France, to see things in France, suggests that they have already been infected, as it were, with European greed, European desire for conquest, etc., etc. So it's a really interesting turn at the end. But there's another turn at the end that I think is as fascinating. So Montaigne says he talked to one of these guys, again, through an interpreter, but the interpreter was bad. But he says the 3 men together sort of had this sort of assessment of French society. This was the period when I think Charles IX was king, and he was very, very young. He took over as king at 10 years old. Charles IX was there. So what Montaigne recounts, according to him, what these indigenous Brazilians thought. They said that in the first place, they thought it very strange that so many grown men, bearded, strong, and armed, who were around the king, it is likely that they were talking about the Swiss of his guard, should submit to obey a child, and that one of them was not chosen to command instead. Second, they have a way in their language of speaking of men as halves of one another. They have noticed that there are among us men full and gorged with all sorts of good things, and that their other halves were beggars at their doors, emaciated with hunger and poverty, and they thought it strange that these needy halves should endure such injustice, and did not take the others by the throat or set fire to their houses. So, taking cultural relativism one step further, Montaigne says, not only am I a cultural relativist, I'm aware that they're doing cultural relativism. They, the indigenous Brazilians, see their ways of looking at the world as more natural, more correct, more right than the way that we Europeans do. So it's not just Montaigne saying, oh, different cultures have different values, and that's all valid and important, and we should respect that. It's literally him saying, here is another group of people with a different set of values than we have saying, why do you do things the way you do? It doesn't make any sense. It's a really, really brilliant essay. And again, it's coming out of this period. Montaigne is coming out of this period where you're having this revolution in the way that people think. You're moving out of the medieval period, and you're moving into a much more cosmopolitan period, a much more critical period, the early phases of the Enlightenment, etc., etc. And of Cannibals, I think shows that kind of transition really, really well.